Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
This cost me a relationship, but I learned more in 1 week than in 5 years, and the strangest part is that the lesson was never hidden. It was sitting in plain sight every single year while I kept pretending that maybe next time it would be different. For 5 straight years, my parents ignored my birthday, not with a late phone call or a half-hearted text, but with absolute silence, and every year I told myself it wasn't worth making into a fight. That maybe they were busy, or maybe Evan's latest crisis had simply drowned out the date again, but this last time broke something clean inside me. 3 days after my birthday passed without so much as a thinking of you, Linda posted a Facebook album of Evan standing next to a shiny car wrapped in a ridiculous oversized bow. And the caption was dripping with the kind of pride you usually reserve for a kid who just cured cancer. So proud of our boy. Proof that sacrifice pays off. Family always wins together. I sat there staring at the post as if it were an invoice addressed to me, because the car wasn't just about him getting rewarded, it was about me subsidizing silence, while they celebrated him like a lottery win. I didn't scream, I didn't throw my phone, I didn't even cry. Instead, I opened a blank note and started making a list of every single way I had been carrying this family while getting treated like an afterthought. It wasn't just the missed birthdays. It was the endless, could you cover dessert for Thanksgiving, just 12 people requests, the grocery runs when Evan was broke. The fact that the so-called temporary loan I gave him during his layoff still sat unpaid 3 years later, while my parents never mentioned it again. The subtle digs when I couldn't show up to one of Linda's endless family dinners because of work. And the worst of all, the feeling that I was the padding around everyone else's sharp edges so they wouldn't cut each other. The longer I wrote, the calmer I felt, because the math was adding up to one truth: they only noticed me when I was useful. That night I typed a short, clinical message and hit send without rereading it. I'm stepping back. No calls, no texts, no requests. If you need to reach me, email about logistics only. I'll review once a week. That was it. No threats, no long speech about feelings, just the kind of clarity you only find when you realize your silence has been costing you more than their neglect ever did. Charles immediately called and accused me of being dramatic. Linda sent 3 sentences about how she thought we were past keeping score. I didn't reply to either. Instead, I went through my accounts and removed my card from the shared cloud storage, the streaming subscriptions, and the digital photo account that somehow always hit my card because you're the one who remembers passwords. I turned off location sharing. I blocked them on social media, not to punish them, but to stop handing myself new reasons to resent them. The first person I told was Marcus, my coworker, because Marcus notices things without prying, and when I explained it, he said one line that rewired my brain: boundaries aren't requests, they're skills. He was right. And when I told him I worried I was being cold, he said something even sharper: you don't negotiate boundaries with people who treat them like suggestions. That's when I realized I wasn't cutting them off, I was cutting off the unpaid labor of pretending. Evan finally texted, and in true Evan fashion, it wasn't a "sorry we forgot" or even a "thanks for the loan" back then. It was, "don't make this about you." I almost laughed because the irony was too perfect. I replied, "I hope the car is safe. Pay your insurance on time." He sent back a thumbs up emoji, which told me everything I needed to know about where I ranked in his world. The first week after my message was calm, almost too calm, as though they were giving me space, but I've learned that in my family calm isn't peace, it's the pause before the pressure starts. And sure enough, week 2 brought the boomerangs. "We need you to bring the side dish. Could you call Aunt Lynn? She listens to you. Evan needs a cosigner for the extended warranty." Charles even tried his classic line, "We just need you to be reasonable." I replied to each with the same sentence: "I won't be participating. Please email logistics only." Copy, paste, done. Every reply sounded cold on the screen, but every time I hit send it felt like I was choosing myself for once. Then out of nowhere, Aunt Joan, the one who walked away from the family group years ago, messaged me, "Proud of you. If you need a place to land for holidays, my table is open." That was the first flicker that maybe I wasn't crazy, that maybe what I was doing wasn't selfish, but simply overdue. I reviewed my finances, And let me tell you, if you want to scare yourself into changing your life, add up what you spend in a year on small things for family. The gas money, the groceries, the prime orders that never get reimbursed, it adds up to thousands. I set a new rule. No spending without a clear plan and repayment, emergencies only. And when the guilt crept in, I reminded myself that 5 missed birthdays wasn't an emergency to them, so why should their endless needs be one to me? By the end of that second week, Linda wrote me an email about how we're a family of givers, not takers, and how public things don't mean anything. The phrase gave her away. Public was exactly what she cared about, which meant my absence was a bigger crack in her image than she wanted to admit. I didn't argue. I just logged it in a folder on my desktop called Receipts with timestamps and screenshots. Because in my family, memory bends under pressure, but paper doesn't bend. And here's the thing, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt exposed, like someone who just locked their own door for the first time and realized how easy it had been for anyone to walk in before. But I also knew something else. The meltdown was coming. Not from me, but from the people who couldn't stand losing the person who made the whole machine look functional. The only question now was simple but sharp. If Linda was so desperate to keep things off Facebook, what exactly was she terrified everyone might see? When the first screenshots landed in my inbox, sent by a neighbor who didn't even know the full story, but sensed something was off, I realized that blocking Linda and Charles on my own accounts hadn't really built a wall so much as opened a window. Because the internet is porous and a single post travels faster through a town than gossip after Sunday service, and what Linda had written under Evan's car photos was so pointed that anyone with basic reading comprehension could see the shape of the target. She wrote, "Some people and families don't know how to celebrate others' wins. Sad." And when a woman from church commented, "Praying for you," Linda doubled down with a reply that included my name and some vague line about me needing grace. She might as well have rented a billboard on Main Street. I knew instantly that the worst thing I could do was take the bait, because Linda's strategy had always been the same: create the appearance of wounded innocence, let others rush in with sympathy, and then sit back while I looked defensive if I tried to explain. So I did what felt unnatural for me but essential for survival: nothing. I didn't reply, I didn't sub-post, I didn't text a cousin with my side. I let the words hang in public where they belonged, because silence doesn't always mean weakness. Sometimes it's just giving rope. By Sunday, Pastor Reed had emailed me asking for a chat, using the kind of soft language church leaders lean on when what they really mean is, we need to restore the image of harmony because people are asking questions. I told him I would meet, but only on one condition: everything discussed would be grounded in facts, not tone or interpretations of respect, because I wasn't going to walk into another room where Linda cried, Charles thundered, and I got labeled the cold one for refusing to absorb it. He agreed, which surprised me, so I walked into that meeting prepared in a way I had never been before. Linda started exactly as expected, with her voice full of false warmth. "We love Rachel, but she has been holding on to things that don't matter." I didn't raise my voice. I pulled out printouts, a calendar showing the last 5 years of my birthdays with no calls logged, bank transfers that had gone to Evan during his hard times with no repayment, and a 2-year-old text from Charles promising, "We'll make it up to you on your big day," followed by nothing. I laid them on the table like evidence in a trial, because that's what it was, a trial of memory versus paper. When Charles said, almost proudly, "We gave Evan the car because he needs to look successful," I watched Pastor Reed's face change. The word "look" was the slip, the truth they could never fully hide. Appearances mattered more than substance, and they were willing to fund an image even while ignoring reality. I asked one question: what does success look like when your daughter's birthday doesn't? And the room went quiet in that thick way where everyone knows a line just got drawn that can't be erased. Evan kept his eyes glued to his phone, not defiant but detached, as though if he didn't lift his head none of this would stick to him. I didn't push. I just said to him quietly, "You can enjoy your car and still tell the truth." He shrugged, and maybe that was honesty in its own way, because sometimes a shrug is just someone admitting they like the benefit too much to challenge the source. After the meeting, Linda did what she always does: turned public again. She wrote a post about the importance of honoring parents even when it's hard and filled it with Bible verses, carefully avoiding my name but lighting it up with neon subtext so obvious that half the church ladies could decode it before dessert. I drafted 3 different responses, deleted each, and finally posted nothing. Instead, I sent Pastor Reed a short email thanking him for focusing on facts and reminding him I would maintain no contact outside logistics. He surprised me again by replying that he understood and even copying my parents on his message. That single act told me something was shifting. But then Linda escalated in a way that crossed a line I didn't think even she would cross. She called my workplace to check on me, spinning a story about being worried I was unstable. When my boss told me about the call, my stomach sank, not because I was afraid of losing credibility at work, but because I realized that for Linda and Charles, there were no off-limits zones if it meant maintaining their version of the story. I immediately went to HR, laid out the basics, and asked that no personal calls from my parents be entertained. HR documented it without judgment, which was both relieving and infuriating, because it shouldn't take professional paperwork to keep your parents from sabotaging your job. Then came a call from Aunt Joan. She said words that rattled the ground under me. "Did you know your grandmother added a note to her trust after a fight with your mother?" I admitted I had no idea. "I was there," she said. So was Mrs. Alvarez. "We witnessed her put language in about gifts being for character, not for show." That was the first time I felt the story was expanding beyond birthdays and cars into territory with actual legal teeth. I doubled down on documentation. I opened new folders, labeled everything with dates, kept screenshots of posts, and most importantly, booked an appointment to run a full credit check because something about Charles's comment, "We took care of things when you were in college," made me feel a chill I couldn't quite place. Marcus offered to help me go through the report when it arrived, because he's the kind of person who sees patterns where others only see numbers. Meanwhile, a cousin who had been silent for years messaged me privately. "I thought you were exaggerating, but I'm sorry. I see it now." That one sentence shouldn't have mattered as much as it did, but it cracked something open, the idea that truth eventually seeps out no matter how much gloss you pour on top of it. Pastor Reed, sensing things were getting heavier than his sermons were designed to handle, scheduled a second meeting, this time without me, to tell Linda and Charles directly that dragging my name into posts and phone calls had to stop. I heard about this not from him but from a church board member who texted me, "You're not crazy." And as small as that sounds, it was the first time someone inside their circle said it out loud to me. The meltdown wasn't a single explosion, it was a steady drip of image management gone wrong, a leak that exposed how the whole structure of their authority had always depended on me absorbing the impact quietly. But I had stopped absorbing, and that meant the pressure was finally visible to everyone else. And then, right on time, the credit report came back, and sitting in the middle of the pages was a store card in my name, opened during college with their home address as the billing location. That discovery changed everything, because suddenly this wasn't about emotional neglect or Facebook posts, it was about legal misuse of my identity, and with a single line on a credit report the entire game shifted from hurt feelings to evidence. The question wasn't whether they had crossed a line anymore. The question was how many times they had crossed it without me knowing, and what exactly I was going to do with the proof now sitting in my hands. Marcus and I sat shoulder to shoulder at his desk after hours, the hum of the office lights louder than usual because silence filled every gap between us, and he slowly turned the pages of my credit report like he was handling evidence from a crime scene rather than a simple financial document, pointing to a line that at first meant nothing to me until I let the details sink in. Because there in black and white was a store card opened in my name during my senior year of college with my parents' address listed as the billing location, and the account had been active for a short period, carrying a handful of small charges, all paid, before going dormant. The thing is, I remember college clearly. The budgeting, the student jobs, the single Visa card I used sparingly for textbooks and food, and yet here was another card tied to me, one I never signed for, never used, and never even knew existed. And when I said to Marcus, almost defensively, that I never had a card in college, he raised an eyebrow until I backtracked and admitted I had forgotten the student visa, which meant that technically I had contradicted myself, and yes, that slip would later become a favorite talking point for family members trying to discredit me. But even if I was wrong about the exact count, I knew one thing with absolute clarity: this account wasn't mine. Marcus explained, patiently but firmly, that identity misuse is rarely an isolated incident, that families under pressure sometimes rationalize opening lines of credit in the names of children because it's all in the family. Until years later, the weight of those decisions falls squarely on the person whose name was borrowed. He told me I needed to file a police report not because I wanted anyone dragged away in handcuffs, but because institutions only take these disputes seriously when a case number exists, and he guided me step by step through freezing my credit for 90 days, disputing the account through the bureaus, and documenting every move in writing. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't cathartic, but it was the kind of slow, deliberate action that builds leverage in a way words never could. I called Aunt Joan that evening because something in my gut told me this was connected to the trust issue she had hinted at earlier, and when I told her about the card, she sighed with a kind of tired recognition and said, "Your mother learned shortcuts from her mother, but your grandmother tried to correct it near the end." She reminded me that she and Mrs. Alvarez had witnessed my grandmother adding a note to her trust that specifically addressed the pattern of appearances over substance, adding language about gifts being for character, not for show. And as she spoke, I realized how long this dynamic had been running, how many decades of rationalizations had paved the path that led directly to me sitting in front of a credit report with Marcus circling lines like a prosecutor. That night, instead of lying awake with spiraling thoughts, I opened Excel and built a timeline that looked less like a personal grievance list and more like a case file. 5 missed birthdays, the bank transfers to Evan, the car celebration post, the church meetings, and now the credit card. When it was all laid out in chronological order, the pattern was undeniable, a progression of small neglects turning into public slights, slights turning into financial burdens, and burdens finally bleeding into fraud. I decided I would make 3 modest requests to Linda and Charles in writing: acknowledgement of the missed birthdays, a repayment plan for the loan I had extended to Evan, and a written statement promising they would not open or use credit in my name under any circumstances. The requests were designed to be reasonable, almost painfully so, because I knew that a refusal would reveal more than any dramatic accusation ever could. I sent the email, attaching the disputed account details as a quiet reminder that I wasn't bluffing. Charles replied first, short and dismissive, "This is insulting." Linda followed with a longer note filled with sentiment about how families don't keep receipts, as though accountability were an act of cruelty rather than the bare minimum expectation. I replied with a single line, "Institutions do." Then I attached the circled page of the credit report. Evan surprised me by calling that night. He insisted he hadn't known about the card, and although part of me wanted to believe him, another part couldn't help remembering how often his ignorance had been conveniently timed. Still, he said something that caught me off guard: "Mom is spiraling." I told him plainly that whether he chose to stay silent or tell the truth was up to him, but my next steps weren't dependent on his cooperation. For once, he didn't hang up. He just breathed heavily into the phone before muttering, "I'll think about it." I filed the police report, the officer on the phone treating me with a professional kindness that made me feel less foolish for involving law enforcement in what so many people would write off as just family business. I completed the credit freeze, and Marcus, ever meticulous, noticed a variant spelling of my last name listed in the records, a subtle trick that could have allowed someone to open additional accounts without immediate detection. He flagged it, documented it, and handed me a sense of security I hadn't realized was missing. Then came the everyday thriller moment I never expected: a certified letter delivered to my door, bearing Charles's handwriting, titled Family Agreement. Inside was a bizarre document drafted, he claimed, by a friend in real estate, outlining expectations for holidays, communication, and respecting family hierarchy. One line actually read, "Rachel will not weaponize the internet against the family." I didn't sign it. I didn't respond. I filed it in my evidence folder, because sometimes the best ammunition arrives wrapped in its own absurdity. When I met Mrs. Alvarez at her kitchen table later that week, she pulled out a folder with notes in my grandmother's handwriting, including a clear paragraph stating, "Gifts are for character and care, not show. Rachel is not to be punished for setting limits." I photographed the page with shaking hands, not because I wanted revenge, but because I finally understood that this wasn't me overreacting, it was me continuing a fight my grandmother had tried to end before she passed. By the time I drove home, I realized the legal stakes weren't abstract anymore. They were written on paper, filed with institutions, backed by witnesses, and slowly forming into a narrative that no amount of Facebook posts or teary speeches could erase. I wasn't a person begging for acknowledgement anymore. I was someone holding evidence, and evidence doesn't negotiate. And just when I thought the ground couldn't shift further, Aunt Joan called again with a revelation that froze me mid-sentence. Buried in that same trust was an addendum naming me executor of a small education fund meant for future grandchildren, a role Linda had always claimed would go to Evan. That single fact meant everything was about to change, because now the battle wasn't just about birthdays or even a car, it was about who my grandmother trusted to carry her values forward, and Linda had spent years pretending it was never me. The invitation to what Linda called a family healing session arrived through Pastor Reed, and although the language was dressed up in church tones of reconciliation and mutual grace, I knew perfectly well that what she really wanted was a stage on which she could perform the narrative of a misunderstood mother while casting me as the rigid, unfeeling daughter who had forgotten the unwritten rule of our household, that image came first. Truth came second, and if the two ever collided then, truth would have to be buried quickly before anyone outside could notice the cracks. I agreed to attend, but only after making my condition clear. Every statement would be treated as though a court reporter were present, recorded and verifiable. Because I was no longer willing to sit in a room where tears and raised voices drowned out facts and left me labeled unreasonable for refusing to fold. To my surprise, Pastor Reed accepted that condition without hesitation, perhaps because even he had grown. Tired of the endless cycle of sentiment followed by erasure that defined so many of our previous meetings. On the day itself, I arrived with a simple folder, thin but heavy with meaning, copies of the credit report highlighting the fraudulent store card, the certified family agreement Charles had sent me that bordered on absurdity in its attempt to legislate respect, and the notes Mrs. Alvarez had shared from my grandmother's handwriting which stated in clear and deliberate terms that Rachel, meaning me, was not to be punished for setting limits. Linda walked in with a binder so thick it looked like a prop. Charles carried a speech he had clearly rehearsed, and Evan wandered in late, which ironically was the most honest reflection of his role in this entire saga. When the meeting began, I refused to open with feelings or broad statements about family unity. I spoke one sentence, carefully chosen and deliberately plain. For 5 years, my parents ignored my birthday. This year they celebrated Evan's car in public, and when I stepped back they escalated with public slights and workplace interference. So I am here not for reconciliation but for documentation. Then I laid the certified letter and credit report on the table without raising my voice, because the paper did the work that emotion could not. Linda immediately pivoted to the familiar script, speaking about love, sacrifice, and generational misunderstandings, but Pastor Reed cut her off gently and reminded everyone of the agreed rule: facts first, feelings later. He asked Charles to read aloud the so-called family agreement, and as his own words echoed in the quiet of that church meeting room, the absurdity of phrases like respecting hierarchy and Rachel will not weaponize the internet became clear even to the board members who had walked in neutral. The sound of the words exposed them more powerfully than any argument I could have made. Then came the moment that changed the trajectory of the entire gathering. Aunt Joan joined by speakerphone, her voice steady and free of the careful politeness that dominates my mother's circles, and she stated plainly that she and Mrs. Alvarez had both witnessed my grandmother adding an addendum to her trust, which not only shifted the grandchildren's education fund into my care, but did so explicitly because I was consistent, reliable, and unwilling to disguise failure as success. Linda tried to object, sputtering about fairness and tradition, but Aunt Joan's voice cut through with the weight of history. Mother insisted. She saw the pattern and she chose differently. In that instant, the hidden kinship of witnesses became public record, and Linda's control of the family narrative cracked in front of an audience she could not manipulate. Charles attempted to recover by suggesting that perhaps Evan could still manage the fund with guidance, but Mrs. Alvarez, who was present in the room, shook her head and said with calm authority that the addendum was unambiguous and the executor was already chosen. Evan himself, perhaps recognizing that the performance was collapsing, muttered the first sentence I had heard from him in months that rang true: "Mom, Dad, this is on you." It wasn't a full transformation, but it was a glimmer of honesty from someone who had spent a lifetime floating on the surface, while others paid the price of keeping him buoyant. I presented one final request, written clearly on a single page, that Linda and Charles cease all public commentary about me, refrain from contacting my employer, and acknowledge in writing both the loan to Evan and the promise not to use my name for financial accounts. I added that if they signed and honored these terms for a full year, I would consider entering family counseling with a licensed therapist, but absent that, I would maintain no contact indefinitely. The request was modest compared to the harm already done, but it was strategic, a reasonable standard that they would either meet or expose themselves by refusing. Pastor Reed nodded and promised to deliver the request formally to the church board, who would place it on record. A move that ensured Linda could no longer spin the narrative unchecked among her friends without the risk of being contradicted by written documentation. 2 days later, a letter arrived from the board confirming that Linda and Charles had been advised to keep future communications limited to email and logistics, with a note stating explicitly that workplace interference was inappropriate. It was short, official, and devastatingly effective because reputations that thrive on performance do not survive official reprimands. That evening, alone in my kitchen, I reread my grandmother's words: "Rachel is not to be punished for setting limits," and for the first time in years I felt the quiet relief of being seen by someone in my bloodline who valued substance over show. The stakes were no longer simply about family dinners or social media posts. They were about the legal recognition of who was entrusted with the family's legacy, and that recognition carried weight I could use not for revenge, but for protection. And yet, even as I felt the balance tilting, I knew the story wasn't finished, because people like Linda and Charles do not accept defeat quietly. They regroup, they reframe, they search for new angles to reclaim control. Which is why, when they delayed responding to my written request and instead circulated word through relatives that I was threatening court, I understood it for what it was: another attempt to spin perception while avoiding responsibility. The only unanswered question, the one hanging heavy in the air as I closed my folders and prepared for whatever came next, was whether they would finally sign the modest acknowledgement and repayment plan, or whether they would force me to press the button I had been holding, the button that would take everything private and expose it in a court of law where appearances could no longer shield them from truth. When their reply finally arrived, not the straightforward signatures I had asked for, but a redrafted document laced with soft threats about family hierarchy, crowded paragraphs about forgiveness on their terms, and a fresh attempt to fold my boundaries back into the old choreography where Linda performed hurt and Charles declared order, I knew there wasn't anything left to negotiate, so I did the thing I had been preparing to do in quiet steps for weeks, the thing that looks like a single choice, but is really the sum of 100 smaller ones, and I pressed the button by finalizing every dispute with the credit bureaus, attaching the police report number Marcus helped me file, mailing the certified letters to the bank that serviced the store card, and sending one last clean message that contained no adjectives and no room for misinterpretation. I would not be participating in any agreement that required me to pretend my own evidence did not exist, and any attempt to open or use accounts in my name would be routed directly to law enforcement without discussion, which meant the center of gravity shifted away from the family stage and into institutions that do not applaud. The ripple arrived faster than I expected because the trustee's attorney called within 48 hours, his tone professional and unruffled as he explained that he had received an inquiry from Linda seeking clarification about the grandchildren's fund. And while he avoided editorializing about the call itself, the subtext was obvious. Linda had tried a back channel, perhaps believing that proximity and insistence could undo ink and witnesses, but the attorney wanted to meet with me. Because the addendum was clear and the executor was me, and clarity prefers confirmation over drama. I scheduled the meeting, brought copies of Mrs. Alvarez's notes and the addendum, looped in Aunt Joan on speaker, and when the attorney asked what structure I intended for the fund, I surprised myself with how ready the answer felt in my mouth. Because I laid out rules that were firm without being punitive, automatic deposits only, disbursements tied to actual education or health expenses with receipts, no discretionary, gifts, and annual summaries that anyone concerned could read without needing a decoder ring or a Facebook post to tell them how to feel, and as he nodded, I understood that I had quietly stepped into a role my grandmother had designed for a future where image would finally stop outranking substance. Linda reacted in a way that only confirmed the wisdom of those rules, showing up at my door with a paper bag of framed photos and a trembling voice polished by years of practice, asking if I was really going to take our family to court, suggesting that if I could just soften, not fix, not repair, but soften, then everything could return to normal, and I stood in my own kitchen with the door open and said the sentence that has become the spine of my life. I am open to truth and change, and I am closed to everything else, which meant the conversation ended not with slammed doors or shouted names, but with a quiet refusal to step back into a role I had vacated on purpose. I mailed one last letter, the cleanest version of the offer they pretended not to understand, a simple acknowledgement of the missed birthdays, a basic repayment schedule for the loan to Evan beginning in 6 months to avoid pretending money grows on apologies, and a signed commitment never to open or use credit in my name again, and I added a single carrot that wasn't really a carrot so much as a real path forward. If they signed and followed those terms for a full year, I would consider joint counseling with a licensed therapist, and if they refused, we would remain no contact and the paperwork would continue its quiet march without any help from me. I didn't beg, I didn't threaten. I simply put the future in writing and let ink do what speeches never could. While that tube of letters moved through the system, the trustee's attorney called with an update that felt like a private benediction, explaining that my grandmother had also designated a modest stipend for administrative time if the executor demonstrated consistent character under pressure, and although the amount would not change anyone's tax bracket, it would pay for therapy without taking from my rent, and it would cover a week away somewhere I didn't have to perform, which, if we are being honest, feels like a fortune when you have spent years subsidizing other people's image management with your time, your money, and your silence. I thanked him, then closed my laptop and let the relief settle, not like fireworks, but like a lock finally clicking into place, because quiet victories are still victories and often the only kind you can live with afterward. Evan texted me a screenshot of his first insurance payment, a small proof that adult decisions were possible even for someone who had been protected from consequences for so long, and although I didn't throw a parade, I replied with a single word, good, because sometimes a plain word at the right time holds more dignity than an essay, and because the fund rules I had set would one day intersect with his life if he chose education for his kids, and I wanted him to understand that fairness has a shape you can learn to trust. I kept going, one unglamorous task at a time, the safe deposit box for originals, the calendar reminders for reporting deadlines, the quiet dinners with Aunt Joan where the bill got split without theatrics. And for the first time in years my life felt like it belonged to me, not because I had conquered anyone, but because I had stopped auditioning for a role that was destroying me, and in that space where silence used to mean erasure it now meant peace. And that peace was paid for by receipts. Not by a plea for kindness from people who confused kindness with control. And just when I thought the chapter was closed enough to exhale, the reversal arrived in an envelope with my father's handwriting, inside of which lay the same agreement I had drafted, but signed by Charles alone, accompanied by a single line that startled me more than any sermon or speech he had ever delivered: Rachel, do what's right and don't look back. Which could be a genuine break from Linda's choreography or just another attempt to manage optics by positioning himself as the Reasonable parent, and I stood at my counter reading that sentence over and over, feeling the weight of a door that might be cracking open or might be another illusion painted on a wall, while the only certainty I had was the one I had built. Whatever happens next will be measured in calendars and ledgers, not captions and crises, and as much as I wanted to believe that a signature meant a step toward truth, I knew that tomorrow would tell me whether Charles had finally stepped out of the performance or whether he had simply found a new spotlight to stand in while asking me to dim my own.